My husband said everything we had was a joint effort. The royalty account was in my name alone. It had been there since before I met him. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Marriage asks us to believe that the line between yours and mine dissolves into ours. And for a long time, that faith is not just belief. It is the organizing principle of a life. You stop thinking in terms of what belongs to you separately. Because the question begins to seem irrelevant inside a household where two people are building the same thing. The accounts merge. The property becomes jointly titled. The history of each person's individual life before the other person entered it, the decisions made, the things acquired, the assets accumulated in a different name in a different season, begins to feel distant enough that you stop mentioning it, not as a secret, but as an old country you've left behind. Diane Kowalski had been living in the country of her marriage for 16 years when her husband's attorney found the royalty account and realized, too late, what the date at the top of the oldest statement actually meant. What the law knows is different from what a marriage knows. The law does not forget what predated the vow. It does not accept that love transforms separately acquired property into jointly held property, unless the holder makes a specific, deliberate legal decision to transfer the title. That decision has to be made consciously, in writing, in a form that the public record can hold. Feeling generous does not transfer a mineral rights deed. Using the income from an inherited account in a shared household does not retitle the account. The law is literal in this way, and its literalness is not a flaw. It is a protection, designed precisely for situations where someone decides, years after the fact, that your property was always theirs. Diane had never made a decision to transfer the title of the royalty account because the thought had not occurred to her. The account was old and familiar, as quiet and consistent as the Osage County landscape that produced it. It generated income. The income went into the household. That was the arrangement, and the arrangement had worked for 16 years without requiring anyone to examine what it was built on, until Victor's attorney examined it and found the date. My name is Diane Kowalski. I am 47 years old. I work as a petroleum land technician at a mid-size oil and gas firm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This means I spend my professional days tracing the ownership history of mineral rights, reading old deeds from the 1940s and 1960s, reconciling complex conveyances, understanding who owns what fraction of what interest beneath what parcel of ground, and making sure that the title is clean before anyone drills into it. It is precise work that rewards patience and punishes assumptions. I was trained for it by watching my father do it for 30 years. My father was a landman in Osage County. Osage County, for those of you who aren't from this part of Oklahoma, has a particular significance in the history of American mineral rights. It was the subject of some of the most significant legal battles over mineral ownership in the 20th century. And its records are some of the most carefully maintained in the state. My father understood this history intimately. He had spent his career in those records, tracing titles, documenting conveyances, making sure that what was on paper matched what was true. He was not a sentimental man in most ways, but he was deeply respectful of the document as a thing with authority. as a record that outlasted the people who made it and continued to speak for them after they were gone. He taught me to read deeds before I could drive. He taught me that dates matter more than narratives, that the recorded document is the authority, and that ambiguity in a property record is a professional failure. He took me to the county clerk's office in Powuska when I was 14 and showed me how to search the records, how to read the index, how to trace a conveyance chain from the original grant to the present owner. I thought, at the time, that he was teaching me a job skill. He was also teaching me how to defend myself, though neither of us knew that yet. When I was 26 years old, 2 years before my marriage, my father died of a sudden cardiac event at his office in Powuska. He was 61. He had been healthy, as far as anyone knew, and the death arrived without warning in the way that the worst losses always do. I was the executor of his estate, a role he had specified explicitly in the will, along with detailed administrative instructions that I could have followed even in my grief, because he had organized everything with the precision of someone who had spent his life making other people's estates legible. Among the estate assets was a small portfolio of producing oil royalty interests in Osage County. Mineral rights he had been quietly acquiring over 20 years of professional practice, buying from landowners who wanted liquidity, holding for the royalty income and for whatever appreciation the underlying value might provide over time. The portfolio was not large by industry standards. He had 8 separate interests spread across 4 sections of land, with a combined monthly royalty distribution that averaged $4,800. Not a fortune. A steady, reliable income from interests in ground that had been producing oil for 60 years and showed no sign of stopping. He conveyed these interests to me by a deed of inheritance, executed and recorded in Osage County 23 months before my marriage to Victor Kowalski. The deed was in my maiden name, Diane Renee Baxter, and it was recorded, stamped, indexed, entered into the Osage County records, in the usual way. He had not left the interests to my brother Glenn, not because of lesser affection, but because Glenn had received an equivalent value in residential real property in an earlier transaction. And my father had intended the mineral rights to balance the distribution between his 2 children. He explained this in a letter he left with the estate documents, in his characteristically direct way, and that letter went into the same organized file as the deeds and the conveyance records. I opened the royalty account at a regional bank in Tulsa, in my maiden name, Diane Renee Baxter. And I set up the receiving instructions with the operating company. The quarterly distributions began arriving within the first year. I set up an automatic transfer from the royalty account to the joint checking account that Victor and I opened after we married, because the $4,800 per quarter, about $1,200 per month, was a useful addition to the household income. And this seemed like the simplest way to manage it. I did not think about the legal distinction between the royalty account as a separate property asset and the distributions as income. It did not seem relevant. Money was coming in, and we were spending it on our shared life, and that was the arrangement. The shoebox where I kept the quarterly statements was in the hall closet, behind some winter items and in front of a stack of old tax files. I kept the statements rubber-banded by year, the oldest at the bottom. Every quarter when the new statement arrived, the pale blue, folded kind, with the production summary and net distribution figure, I would add it to the current year's rubber band, and at the end of the year I would add a new rubber band around the year's complete set, and place it on top of the stack in the shoebox. It was not a complicated system. It was the kind of quiet domestic organization that runs without requiring attention, the way the things we have always done run without requiring attention. Over 16 years of marriage, the shoebox had accumulated 16 rubber-banded sets of quarterly statements. The oldest, at the very bottom, was the set from the year of my father's death, the year the account became mine. The first statement in that set, the oldest statement in the entire shoebox, was addressed to Diane Renee Baxter and dated 23 months before my wedding. I had not looked at that statement in years. I had not thought about what its date meant. It was simply the oldest statement from a long time ago, from a year when I had still been someone's daughter rather than someone's wife. Victor Kowalski was 50 years old when the marriage ended. He manufactured oil field equipment, a practical concrete business in a region where concrete businesses have long traditions. He was organized with money in the way that certain men are organized, methodically, as though financial competence were a form of authority rather than simply a competence. He tracked our investments, managed our brokerage account, met with a financial advisor whose business card and printed summaries I occasionally found in his jacket pockets during laundry. He was not reckless. He was thorough. He had been, during the years of the marriage, the person whose name appeared on most of our financial accounts, which was an arrangement I had not designed but had accommodated, the way I had accommodated other arrangements that made sense in the moment and accumulated, over time, into a picture of the marriage's power structure that I might have described differently if I had been looking at it from outside. The financial advisor summary that I found in Victor's jacket, the year before the divorce proceedings began, listed our marital home, the joint brokerage account, 2 vehicles, and a rental property we had acquired together. It did not list the royalty account. I had assumed, when I found the summary, that Victor's advisor simply did not know about the account, or had not included it because its value was modest relative to the other assets. I had assumed ignorance. I had not assumed strategy. That distinction turned out to matter. Victor filed divorce proceedings in January. His attorney's initial financial disclosure listed the royalty account as a marital asset, citing 16 years of distributions deposited to the household account, and arguing that this pattern of use constituted commingling sufficient to treat the account as marital property. The disclosure did not acknowledge the account's pre-marital origin. It did not mention that the account was titled in my maiden name. It did not mention my father. It described the account as a household income source, nothing more, and argued that 16 years of using its income to support the marital household had converted its separate character into something shared. Victor said it to me directly, across the dinner table, before attorneys were involved. He said, "The royalty money went into the house. You spent it on us. That makes it ours." He said it with the specific certainty of someone who has already reasoned his way to a conclusion and is presenting it as established fact. He looked at me as he said it, and waited for me to receive the logic as obvious. I said nothing. I went to the hall closet that evening and took the shoebox down from the shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. I counted the rubber-banded stacks by year. 16 stacks. Then I lifted the stack from the bottom, the first year, the year my father died, and I found the first statement. I looked at the date. I looked at the date on my marriage certificate, which I retrieved from the file drawer where I keep official documents. The statement was earlier, 23 months earlier. I called Josephine Lark at 8 the following morning. Josephine was a divorce and property specialist in Tulsa, 44 years old, methodical in the specific way of attorneys who have prepared their arguments before they arrive at the meeting. I had known of her professionally in the Tulsa energy community, which is a community rather than a city in its professional relationships. Reputations move efficiently, but had not needed her services before. When I described the royalty account, the pre-marital deed, and the commingling argument Victor's attorney was advancing, she asked one question. "Do you have the deed?" I said I had a copy. She said, "Get me the original from the Osage County records and bring me the oldest quarterly statement." We met 2 days later. I brought the shoebox. I brought the original deed, which I had retrieved myself from the Osage County Clerk's office the day before the meeting. Because if the deed was going to be central to this proceeding, I wanted to hold the original in my own hands, rather than dealing with a reproduction. The clerk at the Pawhuska office had pulled it from the index, made a certified copy for my file, and confirmed the recording date without being asked. The recording date was 23 months before the wedding. It was stamped into the document the way county recording dates are stamped, with the specific permanence of an official act, the ink pressed into the paper, legible and exact. Josephine looked at the deed and the marriage certificate side by side. She looked at the date on the oldest quarterly statement. She said, "Tell me about the account. Tell me everything about how it operated." I told her the account was in my maiden name, had never been jointly titled, had a single account holder, and had been set up to receive royalty distributions from the operating company, and to transfer a portion of those distributions to the household account each month. She asked, "Did you ever add Victor's name to the account?" "No." "Did you ever change the account's titling?" "No." "Did you ever sign any instrument that transferred the mineral rights to Victor or to both of you jointly?" "No," she said. "Then the mineral rights are your separate property under Oklahoma statute, and the royalty account is an account in your name that holds income from your separate property. The income you deposited to the household was income. It was spent as income. The underlying asset, the mineral rights, the account, has never been transferred or jointly titled. That is the distinction that matters." She explained Oklahoma Statute 43 OS 121. Property acquired before marriage, or by inheritance during marriage, is the separate property of the acquiring spouse, regardless of how the income from that property is subsequently used. Using income from a separate property asset in the marital household does not convert the asset itself into marital property, as long as the asset has never been jointly titled or formally transferred. Victor's attorney's commingling argument would require demonstrating that the asset itself, the mineral rights, had been transferred or converted, not merely that the income had been deposited to a joint account. Victor's attorney requested a forensic accounting of all 16 years of royalty deposits. Josephine agreed. She told me privately that the forensic accounting was going to help us, because what it would show was exactly what the account records already showed: a steady stream of quarterly deposits from a single source asset that had been titled in my name since before the marriage and had never changed its titling. The accountant's task would be to confirm this, and confirming it would constitute a complete rebuttal of the commingling argument. The forensic accounting took 6 weeks. The accountant traced every deposit, cross-referenced it against the operating company's payment records, and confirmed that every distribution had originated from the Osage County mineral rights titled in the name Diane Renee Baxter. The mineral rights had never been retitled. The royalty account had never had a joint account holder. Every quarterly payment was income from a separately titled pre-marital asset. The accountant's report also confirmed the current appraised value of the mineral rights, $1.84 million. This was the number Victor's attorney had been looking at, I understood now, when they had decided that the royalty account was worth fighting for. Not the $4,800 per month in distributions, though that was real. The $1. $84 million in underlying asset value, which they had hoped to characterize as marital property. The settlement conference was in December. The light in Tulsa in December is the specific flat gray white of a plains winter, honest and direct, not softening anything. The conference room was in Josephine's building, downtown, with a long table and 6 chairs and a view of the street below where pedestrians moved with the efficiency of cold weather purpose. Victor came with his attorney. I came with Josephine. I brought the shoebox because I thought it was important to have it there even though I did not plan to open it. The history of 16 years of quarterly statements, stacked by year in rubber bands. It felt like the physical record of the account's existence, and I wanted the physical record to be in the room. Victor's attorney made their final argument. They were no longer asserting ownership of the mineral rights themselves, but they were asserting an equitable claim to the royalty income received during the marriage, 16 years at approximately $4,800 per month. A total that they had calculated and were presenting as a marital asset subject to division. The argument was that Victor had relied on this income as part of the household's financial planning, had structured other financial decisions around its presence, and that equitable principles required sharing the benefit he had received from it. Josephine produced the bank statement from the regional bank. The royalty account, titled in my maiden name, Diane Renee Baxter, had never been converted to a joint account. I alone held signature authority. Every distribution had been received by the account in my name and had then been transferred as a household management decision to the joint checking account. The decision to transfer the income had been mine to make. Victor had no legal claim to the account itself or to the income it had produced before I decided to transfer it. She placed the inheritance deed in the center of the table. The original, with the Osage County clerk's stamp pressed into the paper 23 months before the wedding. Victor looked at it. He looked at the date. He looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the statute Josephine had cited in her pre-conference submission. Victor looked at the deed again. He looked at the date again, a second time, as though the second reading might produce a different number. Then he looked at me. I was watching the window. I watched Victor look at the date, and I watched the moment when the date became real to him. When the arithmetic of 23 months before the wedding registered as the answer to the argument he had constructed. The argument required the date to be different from what it was. The date was what it was. It had been what it was since the day the Osage County clerk pressed the stamp into the paper, and it was not going to change. The settlement confirmed the Osage County mineral rights and the royalty account as my separate property. Victor received the equitable division of the jointly titled marital assets, the house, the brokerage, the vehicles, the rental property. The mineral rights were not among them. They had never been. The quarterly pale blue statements continue to arrive 3 times a year at a PO box in Tulsa, addressed to Diane Renee Baxter. I keep them in a new shoebox, rubber banded by year, on the desk in my home office. The home is mine, purchased 8 months after the settlement, a South Tulsa house with a kitchen window that faces west and catches the afternoon light in a way that my father would have appreciated for practical reasons. He liked windows that told you the time of day. Glenn called the week after the settlement closed. He said, "Dad would have liked this." I said Dad knew it would be exactly like this. I didn't explain what I meant by that. I think Glenn understood. My father recorded that deed in my name 23 months before my wedding. He was not thinking about Victor, who did not exist in his life. He was thinking about his daughter and about mineral rights and about the way property law works in Osage County and across the state of Oklahoma, about the fact that a recorded deed in a specific name is the most durable thing you can give someone, because it speaks for itself regardless of what happens afterward. He organized it with the same care he brought to every conveyance he documented professionally. He was being a landman, which is to say he was being precise, and the precision protected something he loved. The most powerful thing you can own, sometimes, is the date on a document, not the amount, not the property itself. The date, which tells the story of what existed before everything else, which answers the question of what was yours before any other arrangement was made. Victor believed 16 years of deposits had rewritten that story. They had not. The date had been there since 1999 in the Osage County records, patient and exact, waiting for someone to look it up. Let me tell you more about the marriage to Victor, because the 23 months between the deed's recording and the wedding are not the whole story. The whole story includes 16 years of a household that functioned, by most external measures, as a successful and organized unit, a house in South Tulsa, a shared financial life, the rhythms of 2 professionals in a regional energy economy who understood the same references and attended the same industry events, and had, for a long time, a genuine partnership in the construction of a shared life. Victor was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, because the story of the settlement is not a story about a bad person. It is a story about a person who believed, with real conviction, that he understood how the assets of the marriage should be organized, and who extended that belief to include assets that were not, in the legal sense, marital. He was wrong about that. His wrongness was not malicious. It was the wrongness of a man who has always been the financial architect of his household and has come to believe, over time, that the scope of that role is broader than it actually is. We had met at an industry conference in Tulsa in the spring of my 27th year, the year after my father's death, the year after I had opened the royalty account and begun managing the mineral rights portfolio on my own. I was not looking for a relationship. I was in the part of grief that is mainly occupied with the practical tasks of an estate and the recalibration that follows when a parent dies younger than expected. Victor was attending the same panel I was. He introduced himself afterward with a directness that I appreciated at a time when I had no patience for indirection, and we had dinner. And 3 months later, we were spending most of our free time together. I remember when I first mentioned the royalty account to him. We had been dating for about 6 months, and we were at his kitchen table going through the financial planning conversation that couples have at the stage when they are beginning to understand that the relationship is serious. I described the account briefly, that I had inherited mineral rights from my father, that the royalty distributions went into an account in my name, that the income was about $4,800 per quarter. Victor nodded. He asked whether I was actively managing the rights or just collecting the distributions. I said I was mainly just collecting the distributions and watching the operating company's production reports. He said, "That's a solid inheritance." And then the conversation moved on to other things, and the royalty account became one of those background facts of our shared life that is known and acknowledged and then subsumed by the daily foreground. I never specifically discussed the legal character of the mineral rights with Victor, whether they were separate property, how Oklahoma statute treated premarital inherited assets, what the implications would be if the marriage ever dissolved. Those conversations do not happen in marriages that expect to last. They happen in the offices of divorce attorneys years later, when the relevant facts are already established, and the question is how they apply to a situation that was not anticipated. What I wish I had known then is not a secret. It is simply the kind of information that seems unnecessary until it is necessary, and that seems unnecessary precisely because marriages are built on the expectation that they will not require it. I could have added Victor's name to the royalty account. I could have retitled the mineral rights jointly. I chose not to, not as a strategy, not as a protection, but because the account was in my maiden name, and had always been in my maiden name, and changing that would have required a deliberate act that no one had suggested, and that had not occurred to me as something that needed to be done. The account worked as it was. The money went into the household as it always had. The arrangement required no decision. That non-decision, not changing the title, not retitling the mineral rights, not adding Victor's name to the account, was the thing that mattered 16 years later. Not as a clever strategy. Simply as the absence of an act that would have transformed the account's legal character. I had done nothing to make the account marital, and doing nothing to a premarital asset is, under Oklahoma law, exactly the right approach. Victor's financial advisor, the man whose business cards and printed summaries I found in jacket pockets over the years, had apparently known about the royalty account for some time. I understood this only after the divorce proceedings began, when the financial disclosure revealed a level of detail about the account that Victor could not have provided without having thought about it carefully. He knew the account number. He knew the approximate distribution amount. He knew it was in my maiden name. He had simply decided, without telling me he had decided, that the 16 years of household deposits were sufficient to characterize it as marital property, and he had taken that position to his attorney as a settled matter, rather than as an argument requiring my acknowledgement. The financial advisor meeting records, which Victor's attorney produced in discovery, included notes from a meeting 18 months before the divorce filing, in which Victor had asked his advisor about the royalty account specifically, whether its distributions, deposited to the household, could be characterized as marital income subject to division at dissolution. The advisor's note in the margin read, potentially depending on commingling. Victor had been thinking about the royalty account and its characterization for at least 18 months before the filing. He had never asked me about it. He had never mentioned that he was consulting an advisor about the character of my inherited asset. He had simply been planning. I read those notes in Josephine's conference room and sat with what they told me. Victor had been aware of the royalty account's potential value as a marital asset long before the divorce. He had consulted professionally about it. He had developed a strategy around it. And he had said nothing to me about any of this, not when he found the business card summary that did not include the account. Not when we had conversations about our financial situation during the last year of the marriage. Not at the dinner table when he explained, with his characteristically confident certainty, that the distributions going into the house made the account ours. That silence was not passive. That was a decision. Josephine's work during the procedural period was methodical in the specific way of professionals who have thought through the sequence before they begin executing it. She ordered the Osage County title search and confirmed the deed. She submitted the statutory authority to Victor's attorney. She requested the royalty account records from the bank, confirming the titling and the signature authority. And then she requested the operating company's payment records, which confirmed, distribution by distribution, exactly what the account had received and when. The operating company, when contacted, was immediately cooperative. They had been making quarterly payments to an account in the name Diane Renee Baxter for 16 years, and their records were precise to the cent. They confirmed the titling of the mineral rights. They confirmed the payment history. They noted, when Josephine asked, that the account had never been identified to them as anything other than a single holder account in my maiden name. The forensic accountant's work was similarly clear. 6 weeks of tracing distributions through the account records, confirming the source of each deposit, establishing that no distribution had come from any source other than the Osage County mineral rights, and confirming that the mineral rights themselves had never been retitled. His report was 112 pages of confirmation that what the documents already showed was exactly what was true. I read the report the weekend it arrived. I sat with it at my kitchen table, the kitchen of the house Victor and I still shared while the proceedings moved forward, a strange domestic situation in which the ordinary household rhythms continued while the legal structure of the household was being dismantled in conference rooms across town. I read the forensic accountant's report and recognized it as a thorough, professional confirmation of something I had known to be true from the beginning, that the mineral rights were mine, that the account was mine, that the distributions had been income from my asset and not a transformation of the asset itself. What the report could not tell me, and what no document could tell me, was why Victor had believed the argument would work. Whether he had genuinely convinced himself that 16 years of deposits had made the mineral rights marital, or whether he had understood the law well enough to know he was overreaching, and had simply calculated that overreaching was worth the attempt. I do not know the answer to that question, and I have stopped wanting to know it. The argument did not work. The law was what it was. The date on the deed was what it was. Those facts did not change regardless of what Victor had believed or calculated. The December settlement conference was the end of the procedural sequence, and I have described it already. What I have not described is how I felt sitting in the conference room with the shoebox beside me, watching Victor look at the date on the deed for the second time. What I felt was not triumph. It was closer to recognition. The recognition you feel when a thing that has always been true is finally acknowledged as true by the people who had been contesting it. The date on the deed had been recorded in the Osage County records for 18 years by the time it was placed on that conference room table. It had not needed my defense. It had simply needed to be produced. The house I bought 8 months after the settlement is a South Tulsa Craftsman. a style that persists in older Tulsa neighborhoods with the specific dignity of things built for permanence rather than trend. It has a deep front porch and a kitchen with a western window and a study at the back, where I keep my professional files and my personal records and the new shoebox with the pale blue quarterly statements rubber banded by year. I bought the house in my own name. I specified this to my real estate attorney before the first showing, not because the specification was legally necessary. It would have been mine in any case, but because I wanted the act of specification to be deliberate. The title would read Diane Renee Baxter, which is the name I was using professionally and which I had, after the divorce was finalized, returned to fully. The name on the house and the name on the royalty account matched. This seemed correct. The royalty statements continue to arrive quarterly, in the pale blue folded format that has not changed since my father first received them from the operating company in the 1980s. I add each one to the current year's rubber band, and at the end of each year, I band the set and add it to the top of the stack in the new shoebox. The stack is shorter than the one in the old shoebox, fewer years, a fresh start. But the practice is the same, inherited from the same man who organized the mineral rights and recorded the deed and explained property law to a 14-year-old at the Powasco County Clerk's office. My brother Glenn and I have lunch every 3 or 4 months in Powasco, at a restaurant that my father used to favor for its proximity to the courthouse. We talk about the mineral rights occasionally. Glenn manages a similar portfolio inherited from our father's estate, smaller than mine and structured differently, and we sometimes compare notes on the operating company's production reports and the quarterly distribution calculations. We do not often talk about Victor or the settlement. Glenn does not require the topic to be named in order to have understood it. He said, "At the lunch we had the week the settlement closed, Dad would have liked this." And I said, Dad knew it would be exactly like this. I was not being poetic. My father was a landman who had spent 30 years watching disputes over mineral rights develop, proceed through the legal system, and resolve according to the documents. He had seen cases exactly like mine, or close enough to mine that the structure would have been familiar, where the question of what was separately acquired before a marriage determined the outcome of a dissolution long after the marriage had formed. He had seen those cases resolve according to the deed, the recording date, the title. He would not have been surprised that mine resolved the same way. He would have said, of course it did. The deed said so. He had always believed that the deed said so. I kept the shoebox from the marriage, the old one with the 16 rubber-banded stacks going back to the year my father died. I did not throw it away. I put it in the storage room at the back of my new house, on a shelf where I keep the things I am not currently using, but am not ready to discard. It is an archive. The pale blue statements in those 16 stacks are the record of 16 years of quarterly payments to a separate property account during a marriage where the account's character was eventually contested. They are also, and more simply, the record of a mineral rights portfolio that my father assembled over 20 years and gave to me, and that has been producing income continuously since before I was 30 years old. I will likely keep both shoeboxes for a long time, not as monuments to anything, but as records. My father's principle about documentation did not specify what you do with the documents after they have served their purpose. I think the answer is, you keep them, because the period in which they have served their purpose is not always clearly bounded. Josephine closed the file on my case and sent me a brief letter saying the matter was resolved and wishing me well. I wrote back thanking her, and I noted in my thanks that the simplicity of the outcome had been a function of the simplicity of the documents. The deed was what it was. The date was what it was. She had not had to construct an argument so much as produce the evidence that the argument was already settled. She wrote back, "That's the best kind of case." I thought about that. I thought about how my father would have characterized the same thing, not as luck, not as strategy, but as the natural consequence of records that were made correctly in the first place. The deed was recorded correctly. The date was accurate. The titling was clear. The consequences of those correct, accurate, clear records 23 months before my wedding persisted through 16 years of marriage and 18 months of contested divorce proceedings without requiring modification or interpretation. They simply existed in the Osage County records, exactly as they had been when they were made. That is what the county clerk stamp is for. Let me tell you about the procedural period more specifically, because the mechanics of a property dispute in a divorce are the kind of thing that sounds abstract until you understand what they require of the people involved. What they require, first and most concretely, is patience. The patience to sit across from someone you once shared a life with while attorneys argue about what belongs to you. The patience to wait for a forensic accountant to confirm, over 6 weeks, what you have known since you first looked at the date on the deed. The patience to hold your position while someone argues that your inheritance is theirs, and to hold it without anger. Not because anger would be wrong, but because anger requires energy that the process needs. I had Josephine's steady pace to orient myself to. She moved through the procedural sequence with the unhurried thoroughness of a person who has done this many times and understands that the quality of the preparation determines the quality of the outcome. She did not rush. She did not reassure me unnecessarily. When I asked how strong our position was, she said, "Very strong," with appropriate caution. When I asked whether the forensic accounting could produce anything that would complicate the separate property argument, she said, "Not if the account has been titled and operated the way you describe." I confirmed it had been. She said, "Then the accounting will confirm what the deed already shows." She was right. The forensic accountant's report was exactly what she had said it would be. A thorough, painstaking confirmation of what the documents showed. Every distribution traced to the mineral rights. Every deposit confirmed as income from the Osage County portfolio. The mineral rights themselves never retitled, never jointly held. Never subject to any instrument that would have altered their separate property character. 112 pages that said, in various ways and with various supporting calculations, this was hers before the marriage, it remained hers during the marriage, and nothing that happened during the marriage changed what it was. Victor's attorney reviewed the report and submitted a response, arguing that the volume of the distributions, their regularity, their integration into the household's financial planning, demonstrated a reliance interest sufficient to justify equitable consideration. Josephine's written counter-response was 4 pages. She addressed the reliance argument directly. Reliance on income from a separate property asset, however long-standing, does not create a legal interest in the asset itself. Victor had relied on the $4,800 quarterly contribution to the household budget. His reliance was real. His legal interest in the underlying mineral rights, based on that reliance, was not. The counter-response was submitted 3 weeks before the settlement conference. Victor's attorney requested a brief extension to review the forensic report and the statutory authority. Josephine granted 1 week. The conference was rescheduled accordingly. In the week between the counter-response and the rescheduled conference, I did something I had not done since the year my father died. I drove to Pawhuska. Not to the courthouse this time, not to the county clerk's office. I drove out to the sections where the mineral rights lay, 4 sections of Osage County land where oil had been produced for 60 years, and where a small pump jack or 2 still operated in the way that old Osage County oil production operates. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. I parked on the county road that ran alongside the westernmost section and got out of the car and stood in the December air looking at the land. It was flat and cold and gray, the way the Osage prairies are in December, with the brown grass of the season and the low sky and the particular quality of silence that belongs to large, flat places in cold weather. The pump jack was working. I could see it at the far edge of the section, its slow, rhythmic motion visible at a distance. There was nothing else moving. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, thinking about my father. Not about the divorce, not about the settlement conference, but about the man who had driven this road and known these sections, and understood what was beneath the grass, and had organized the documentation of those rights with the same precision he brought to everything. He had never told me the sections were beautiful. He had described them in professional terms, production history, royalty rates, operating agreements. He was a landman. He saw the land through the lens of its documentation. But standing there in December, with the pump jack working in the distance and the silence all around, I thought the land had a kind of beauty that was not separate from its documentation, but was somehow expressed through it. Through the fact that it had been owned and understood and recorded carefully by someone who respected what it was. I got back in the car and drove to Tulsa. The settlement conference was the following week. I did not mention the drive to Josephine. It was not relevant to the legal proceedings. It was relevant to me. The morning of the settlement conference, I dressed as I dress for professional work, not formally, but with the quiet precision of someone who takes the meeting seriously. I brought the shoebox. I brought a legal pad. I drove to Josephine's building and parked in the garage and rode the elevator to the conference room floor and arrived 6 minutes before Victor and his attorney. The conference room was warm and still. The December light came through the north, facing windows in that flat, honest way I have described. I set the shoebox on the chair beside me, not on the table, not as an exhibit, just there, where I could reach it if needed. I did not open it during the conference. I did not need to open it. The original deed and the bank statement and the forensic accounting report were all Josephine needed, and she had them organized in her exhibit binder in the order she would produce them. What I remember most clearly from the conference is not the arguments or the exhibits, or even the moment when Victor looked at the date on the deed. What I remember is the quality of the silence in the room just before Josephine placed the deed in the center of the table. It was the silence of a moment that has been building toward itself for a long time, not dramatic, not charged with anything except a kind of inevitability. The deed had been in the Osage County records for 18 years. It had been exactly what it was for 18 years. The silence was simply the moment when everyone in the room stopped arguing about it and acknowledged that. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is perhaps the least legal part of this story. In the months after the settlement, I found myself thinking about the word inheritance differently than I had before. I had always understood it as a category of law, a conveyance from a deceased person to a named recipient, documented in a deed, recorded in the county records, producing rights that the law protects. My father had taught me that understanding. It was useful and accurate, and it had served me well in a conference room in December. But I also found myself understanding it as something that does not appear in any legal instrument, the inheritance of how to treat documents. My father had kept his files the way he kept everything, with the specific care of someone who believed that the record of a thing was not merely a representation of the thing, but was, in some practical sense, the thing itself. A mineral rights deed recorded in the county is not just evidence that you own the rights. It is the ownership. The record is the fact. That belief, transferred not in a deed, but over years of watching him work, hearing him explain, accompanying him to county clerks' offices in the flat oil country towns of northeastern Oklahoma, was, I came to understand, as real an inheritance as the mineral rights themselves. Glenn has the same quality. I see it when we compare notes on the quarterly statements, when he sends me production reports with margin annotations the way our father used to do. He inherited it too. We did not discuss whether to inherit it. We simply watched, and the habit became our own. And 16 years of correctly maintained records and an untouched account title proved, not to me, I already knew it, but to a conference room, that the habit had consequences worth having. I keep the shoeboxes for the same reason, not as records of a divorce, not as monuments to a legal outcome, but as the practice itself, continued, consistent, year after year. Rubber banded and dated and stored in the way my father's hands first showed me. If there is a mineral rights deed, a royalty account, a property interest, or any financial instrument in your name from before your marriage, know what the date is. Know what the law in your state says about it. And if someone tells you that 16 years of household deposits have made it theirs, bring the oldest document. Thank you for listening today. Leave me your city in the comments, and please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you next time.